You've heard of peace through strength. This is re-election through strength. I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle now. And Bill, as we look at this whole incident surrounding President Trump ordering the strike on Qassem Soleimani, the Iranian retaliation with ballistic missiles, and how that affects the status quo between the United States and Iran and in the greater Middle East, we can also never lose sight of the fact that there's a presidential campaign happening in 2020, and sometime in early November, voters will go to the polls and cast a ballot about this. In the meantime, between now and then, there will be stump speeches from President Trump and his proxies, as well as from all of the various Democratic candidates, and then eventually the Democratic nominee and their proxies out on the campaign trail. And there was a time, I think, Bill, in American politics where there were some kind of ethical guidelines, or at least a sense of prudence in how you discussed U.S. foreign kinetic activity, let's call it, in this case, short of war, that was different on the campaign trail than just simply standing up and either crowing about what we were doing militarily or criticizing the U.S. foreign policy strategy. Do you get kind of the overall question I'm grappling with here?
Yeah. There was a period of increased civility and gentility in American politics that really, I think it's probably fair to say, well after Reconstruction, maybe around the turn of the last century, somewhere around 1900, 1910, all the way up through the 1960s. American politics were not as ugly as they are today, or as ugly as they were before. It bears mentioning some of the things that happened in the years leading up to and immediately after the Civil War. Charles Sumner was nearly beaten to death on the floor of the House by Preston Sturgis, a Southern Confederate, basically beat him with a cane nearly to death and broke his cane, and thousands of Southerners sent him replacement canes. So these kind of things just need to be remembered in terms of us thinking that this is a unique descent into hell. And I've seen parliaments even in Japan where people break out into fistfights or somebody gets shot and so on. So just for some perspective. But I have not seen anything like what I've seen in the last several years. And I'm reminded of Harry Reid, at the time the Senate Majority Leader, saying in 2006, I want to say.
Democrat Senate Majority Leader.
Yes, saying that the war in Iraq was lost on the floor of the Senate. That's almost inconceivable by the standards of 20th century American politics.
And that's the heart of the question here. And let me give you just a couple of examples. Yesterday, I saw some footage of Joe Biden, who was taking questions and clearly trying to position himself as a steadier hand of the ship of state than President Trump would be. Meanwhile, Mayor Pete Buttigieg, the former South Bend, Indiana mayor now, he has basically said that taking out a bad guy isn't always a good idea with regard to the strike on Qassem Soleimani. And so clearly these politicians are vying for that position. But it's one thing, Bill, to stand up and say, I don't like the president's Social Security policy, and I think it will doom our country. But quite another thing, as you point out, to stand up and say, I don't like the president's policy with Iran, and frankly, we're doing the wrong thing. Even if you do that on U.S. soil, doesn't it seem like, in a sense, you're kind of aiding and abetting the enemy?
It does. And I think
so. How do you tread that gap, you know?
Well, here's what I think. Here's why I think it's happening. I think that the reason that it's happening is because we are in a position where the success of our military has been so spectacular that we are no longer, whether we are or not, we no longer perceive ourselves to be in danger, existential danger. And that's what often caused people to basically rally around the idea of America foreign policy being off limits. Just give you two quick examples. There was a case, and I don't remember exactly what it was, the details, but there was a case during World War II where the Republican challenger to Franklin Delano Roosevelt was campaigning, and I've lost the details, campaigning on some issue. And Roosevelt basically called him in and said, listen, here's what's going on behind the scenes with the war. This is why we're doing these things, and we're going to ask you to keep this under your hat. And he did, because World War II was more important than beating Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Now, once we have a Democratic nominee, they will start reading him in or her in to what's going on the behind-the-scenes foreign policy. But at this point, we don't have that.
But in this case, this was a Republican challenger gaining traction politically against FDR, and FDR going directly to this person and appealing to their sense of patriotism above their sense of politics, and it worked, because we were fighting for our lives against the Japanese and the Germans. A similar situation happened, I mentioned this in passing last episode, during the Cold War, where the CIA had constructed a ship, ostensibly a research ship built by Howard Hughes to mine magnesium modules off the floor of the ocean, but in fact was purpose-built to raise a Soviet submarine. And I want to say it was Sid Hirsch or Al Hirsch, I forget, investigative journalist, a real bulldog. And you got to remember, this was at the time of Watergate, when trust in the government was at an all-time low. And he had caught whiffs of this program. It was called Project Azorian. And he'd heard rumors to the effect that this was in fact an effort to raise a Soviet sub, and had put out a small, like a lead article on this before he really got into detail. And he was brought into to a CIA room, and he was read the entire. They read him into the entire program, told him exactly what they're doing. They're saying that the ability to raise this Soviet sub without the Soviets knowing about it is of such overwhelming national security concerns that we absolutely are. We're not ordering you, we're asking you if you could sit on this one. And I believe the deal was, if you sit on it now, we promise you that when the story breaks, you will be the person who gets all the inside information. And Sid Hirsch said yes. Turned out it was Jack Anderson, a kind of a conservative, Mormon anyway, who finally broke the story, and we weren't able to go back and finish that mission. Anyway, my point is this. You could make an appeal to people's patriotism over their politics in World War II because we were facing an existential threat from Germany and Japan. You could make an appeal to people's patriotism over politics during the Cold War because we were facing 25,000 Soviet nuclear warheads, and many of them were based on submarines. Today, we do not, whether it's true or not, we do not have the perception of that kind of threat to appeal to. And the last time we did was in the days after September 11th, and for quite a long time, several years, there was relative civility in American politics because we suddenly woke up to the fact that we are not, in fact, invulnerable to external threats. And it took many years for that sort of 9/11 sense of unity to sort of dissipate. So I think the explanation, I don't think it's a good excuse, but the explanation, I think, is that when you ask people to put their patriotism ahead of their politics, they only do that when they feel like that their country is under threat, and it doesn't appear to be under threat these days. And that's half of the story. And the other half of the story is, I'm sorry to say, that even since 2001, the Democratic Party's attitude towards America as a country has changed so phenomenally. This is not an opinion. You go to see the Democratic national debates, and there's not an American flag on the stage because significant numbers of the Democratic Party would be offended by seeing the American flag on the stage. And that is more of a threat to this country than either Japan, Germany, the Soviet Union, or Islamic terror.
So let's take it from the other side of the aisle. President Trump on the campaign stump, as well as his proxies out there. There, of course, is an obligation if you're a candidate running for re-election to prove that you've done a job that is worth getting, rehired, basically. Mm-hmm. And yet you've always got this, things that you can't tell people. You are in the process of coordinating and communicating with allied governments. You're in the process of undercutting and in essence, sabotaging or having a contest with enemy governments or adversarial governments. All of that, how do you get up? I guess I should say this. As voters, how much crowing by the sitting president should we tolerate on the campaign stump? And at what point does it go over the line and you say, hey, wait a minute, this isn't about you?
Well, Barack Obama got a lot of mileage. I'm not saying he did it, so we should do it. I'm just trying to set some perspective. Barack Obama got a lot of mileage out of being president when Osama bin Laden was killed. But
General Motors is alive and Osama bin Laden is dead.
That's right. Osama bin Laden's location was determined by people in the Bush administration using waterboarding on people who had already admitted responsibility for killing 3,000 Americans. That's how we found bin Laden. So the man who basically criticized the previous administration for techniques benefited from those techniques and then was able to turn that into a campaign issue. So was that out of bounds? I don't think it was out of bounds. I think I think when Barack Obama was president, bin Laden was removed under his administration. There's a fair amount of talk about how enthusiastic Barack Obama was about this, but that's just talk. The fact
I remember criticism at the time that he had dithered over that decision.
And I believe that's correct. But the bottom line is, bottom line is that when somebody had to make the final decision to launch that strike, no matter how much he may have dithered or how much pressure he was under, doesn't matter. Ultimately, he authorized the strike. So the credit for that bin Laden thing it's not inappropriate for him to claim credit for that. That's what I'm saying. I think what I would like to see, and this is when I say like to see, it's not what I hope to see, because there are many things that I would hope to see. Let me rephrase that. What I would hope to see is different than what I would like to see. I would like to see a return to civility and a return to some borders of respect. That's not going to happen. So all I'm left with now is a hope. And the hope is that if the Democrats don't decide to turn this into an issue, then the Trump administration won't do much more than saying, you may recall ISIS from 4 years ago.
One wonders whether President Trump, and it's hard to imagine him doing this, but whether a presidential incumbent on the stump would be well within the bounds of propriety to just get up there and praise the accomplishments of our foreign policy establishment, of our military, of the people who actually conducted various elements that have led us to where we are, and somehow come up short of saying, hey, look, I'm the guy that called in the Hellfire missile. Well,
I would like to think, again, this is a question of hope versus, expectations and so on. I would like to think that would be the case. I think Donald Trump has every possible justification to say that ISIS was a major threat to world peace and to security of civilians, and they're not anymore because I've decided to kill them instead of warn them. That's a completely legitimate thing. And for Trump to claim credit for it personally and not give the credit to the military, I think would be a public relations mistake. But once again, I'm not. You've often pointed out, am I saying that these people did something bad, therefore we get to do something bad too? It's not the position I'm arguing from. But when Obama talked about the bin Laden raid, he used, as usual, me, I, me, I, me. If Donald Trump does the same thing, he'll be accused of grandstanding and all of these other things that were smiled upon when Barack Obama did it. So I bring that up only to say that Donald Trump operates in a very different PR environment than Barack Obama did.
It's funny
but my experience, limited experience with Donald Trump is this: he does not strike me as somebody who often just runs around poking a stick at people, but he does certainly have a reputation, and a deserved one, for poking back hard when he gets poked. And I don't anticipate any way that aspect, that dynamic is going to change. So the question is, I think, is he going to be poked on this issue? Are the Democrats going to come out and say he nearly got us into war, he's led us closer to war, all the rest of it? And if he does, if they start to criticize him as having made America a more dangerous place, then in that case, I think the president has not only the right, but the moral obligation to reply in as much detail as he chooses to show why this is in fact not the case.
It makes me think of football players who essentially upstage their own accomplishments by, getting into the end zone and then doing some sort of fancy dance. And, there's the old joke that a referee looked at the running back and said, son, why don't you act like you've been here before and you plan to come again?
Right.
It's a wonder to me that so few politicians have the sensibility, not even the grace, not even the dignity, but just the savvy to say, look, my great accomplishment is evident to all. When I do the end zone dance, it actually diminishes from the accomplishment. Rather, why don't I just let the praise of the people rest on the action itself?
Yes. And that is exactly how I feel. And that is exactly what I would like to see. And we may not see that. And if we don't see that, it's because the American people in 2016 elected a particularly flashy and confident and cocky running back who is going to spike the ball whether he should or not. The question then becomes, while we may not approve of the spiking of the ball from a sense of decorum and a sense of what we would like to see, the bottom line is he's got us in the end zone for 6 points when we were constantly just being, 4 and out,
And he gets a new contract.
So we have reality and we have expectations and we have hopes. My hope would be that Donald Trump would not personalize these victories. It's got nothing to do with Donald Trump. This has got nothing to do with him. It's got nothing to do with his accomplishments. I agree with you 100%. This is kind of like Audie Murphy coming back and, who was for those of you younger, who was a most decorated soldier in World War II, basically had an entire German division or something come in. It wasn't a division, but he had huge, hundreds and hundreds of German soldiers coming after him. He climbed on top of a burning tank, got his 50 caliber out and just, basically saved his position. He ended up being a movie star because of that. Well, briefly anyway. But Audie Murphy didn't come back and say, I pretty much won World War II by myself. If all the rest of these guys had been more like me, this war would have been over in 20 minutes. Yeah. He didn't do that. And we find that kind of bragging about achievements, especially achievements where other people's lives are on the line, to be unseemly and rightfully so. So because I don't like to see that in anybody, I'd like to not see it during this election campaign. But, and I don't think we will unless he is called out for being militarily incompetent and making the country a more dangerous place, which I suspect is going to happen. And if that happens, then the running back in Donald Trump, the cocky running back, Heisman Trophy winner kind of guy, is going to go out there and he's going to spike the ball and he's going to continue to spike the ball. I would rather have him point to the scoreboard. I think that's a much better way to respond to taunts. But I don't think he's built that way. And that's the price we pay for Donald Trump. Donald Trump, you have to have the confidence and the ego that he has to simply fight against the amount of social pressure and moral appropriation that's placed on him all the time. You have to have that kind of cockiness and that sense of, I don't care what they say, I'm right, and I'm going to show them I'm the best out there. I'm going to put this ball in. I'm going to this defensive back who sacked me last time. I'm going to score a touchdown, and when I see this guy, I'm going to put it in his grill. Okay, is that what I want? No, but is that what I'm willing to accept? Yes.
Yeah, it's always great at the end of the football game when they interview the quarterback and say, "How did you do it?" And he says, "We have a great team. Yeah, coach made a great plan."
And everybody knows that when a quarterback has an outstanding game, and when the quarterback says, "No, we got great receivers, I had plenty of protection, the offensive line was fantastic," and the coach, when you hear that, I know. The other team knows, and certainly the quarterback is aware of the fact that he's had a remarkable performance. But by giving credit to others, he is exhibiting a generosity of spirit and also is in fact shining a spotlight on something that is important. He could not have had that game without the protection from the offensive line. He could not have had that game without having outstanding receivers. He could not have done it. He's the guy in the spotlight, and it's appropriate for him to not only share the credit, but to basically give the credit to everybody else. That is the kind of behavior that we have come to admire and even expect from heroes in the Western culture. And to the degree that I admire that myself, and I admire it very, very much, I would like to see that happen on the campaign trail. If it doesn't happen on the campaign trail, I'll be disappointed, but it's not going to change my vote.
Ladies and gentlemen, the credit for this episode goes to the members at BillWhittle.com and to our friends over at Patreon.com/BillWhittle, as well as our buddies at the Patriot Post, America's News Digest. We'll put some information about them and some click-through links for you in the description below. If you'd like to join in these kinds of conversations in the Caribbean, on a boat, you can do that in May. If you go to BillWhittle.com, you'll see the link to the cruise that we are doing from May 15th to 18th aboard Royal Caribbean's Navigator of the Seas. It's a 3-night cruise with live productions of these shows, as well as a lot of informal interaction among the hosts and your fellow members and fans of these shows. We invite you to become part of that.
And tickets are selling.
And
they're selling. We're going to have ourselves a blast.
Selling. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members for making this possible.